self-contained and inclusive honors English and reading and AP language arts classes to students in grades 6 through 12. Sarah has a master's in special education, including gifted and talented education specialist certification from Johns Hopkins University. In addition to being twice exceptional herself, Sarah is the mom to a precocious 7-year-old daughter and lives with her 2E husband and many, many cats. Let's turn it over to Sarah to share her many tips for serving and supporting your 2E students. Sarah?
Thank you. I'm going to get ready to share my screen. And while I do seven isn't the current number of cats that we have around here, so that's a lot. All right, hopefully you guys can see my screen. It looks like it. So hi, and welcome to our webinar, Beyond Backpacks and Binders. So I'm really excited to do this webinar. I know that it's really geared towards teachers, but I also know there are quite a few parents who signed up for this because you told me you did. And so as we go through these strategies, I really encourage you to think about how you can adapt them to your home, how you can use them as points of dialogue between yourself and your students, teachers, educators, and just other ways that you think that you can possibly use them. The other thing I really always enjoy is going ahead and putting in the chat when we get to different topics. If there's something that you do in your home that is really helpful to you or to your family or to your child, go ahead and toss it in the chat because I always love to look through those afterwards, and I've incorporated a lot of ideas over the years that I've gotten from other parents and educators into my presentations. So we're going to go ahead and get started. And we are, oh, you've already seen me. But down here, I do have a bit.ly for this presentation, as well as a handout that I'll reference later. I don't think it does you any good to watch it now. Just stick with us, but go ahead and feel free to use that link afterwards, and you can get a copy of the presentation. And so we're going to start with really talking about who are our 2E students. And in this section, I'm not going to talk about really how we identify our students, but rather why we identify our students. And so why do we define who our twice exceptional students are? And, you know, when we're talking about who they are, we really want to know what it is that they're going to need from us as their educators. And when I think about twice exceptional students, I kind of put them into 3 broad categories. I have my students who are identified, my students who have been identified as gifted, they're identified as having a disability, which is not the same thing as being identified with a 504 or an IEP. Being in a public school setting, that's often how we look at it, but we also know there are plenty of students who have disabilities who do not have the paperwork around them. And in private settings, you might not have that. So we're saying identified in that it is known that there is some type of disability. Then we have our sort of identified students. And our sort of identified students are students who are either identified as gifted or identified as a disability, but nobody's necessarily picked up on the other half of who they are. And then our final category are our suspected kids. These are ones who we suspect they need something different. We suspect that we are not capturing what it is that we need to know about them, but they're not identified as having a disability or being gifted. And so these are our students who most often, I think, get left behind because they don't have somebody on either end working on either set of their needs. And again, when we said, why do we need to know this? Well, because we know about masking, and we know that our twice exceptional students mask who they are and frequently mask what it is that they need. So when we look at our gifted identified students, these are students who are possibly masking what their disability is. This can present sometimes as anxiety or present as students who are becoming perfectionistic. They really want to show that giftedness, and they have trouble either knowing that they have a disability or rectifying where their disability is as they're performing. We have our disability identified students. So those are our students who they know they have a disability, their adults know they have a disability, but what they haven't seen is where that giftedness is, and they haven't really identified where those strengths are because that disability is masking the giftedness. And then in our third group, the not identified students, these are our students who they tend to look what we would say is average because the gifts and the disabilities mask each other. And so while it looks average, it's not really an average student. It's a student who's having neither their gifted needs nor their disability needs met. And so they are struggling on both ends of their personalities, both ends of their brains. And so we want to know who our kids are, because if we don't think about having these students in our classrooms, and we don't think about actively that these guys exist, we won't be able to be prepared for them. For the most part, we know that twice exceptional students are very under-identified across the country. And so just putting in mind that these guys do exist and they're in our classrooms, and they very likely fall into these masked categories more so than the identified categories, it helps us be aware of what we can do to set up our workspaces and our approaches to teaching in order to support those needs from the start. So really summarizing this into, when we know who our students are and we know what their strengths and needs are, we are better able to define what it is that we can provide for them. If we know about masking and we know that masking occurs, then we know what to look for more in our classroom. And so when students are having difficulty or students are showing strengths and precociousness and might need a little bit more, we know that we can provide that little bit more. And then also knowing who they are also will help you define what resources are available to you and to your students. There are resources out there. And knowing who your students are means you will know better who to ask, what questions to ask, and where to go to get the support that the students need. So we're going to move into a section now on what we will call the hidden curriculum. And this is really going to be the bulk of the talk today, because as we take apart what the hidden curriculum is, I really want to focus in on what strategies we're using. So those are our tips and our tricks, but really also how do you do it? I love, getting tips and tricks when I go to presentations, but I'm often left feeling like I don't know how to implement what those tips or tricks are. So as we go through today, that's really what I would like us to focus on, is kind of the how we do these pieces to help our students. I just really like that slide, but it's really hard to read, so I didn't do my entire presentation with that. So what is the hidden curriculum? So broadly speaking, a hidden curriculum is when we are talking about values, expectations, cultural norms that are expressed within the school system. They can be expressed by teachers, by the school culture, and by the system as a whole. And then the hidden curriculum for twice exceptional students will also include norms and expectations in the classroom of how class functions, what routines are expected, what are social norms within the classroom, and just the how to function every single day in the classroom. These are things that are rarely explicitly taught. If they are explicitly taught, they're often mentioned or taught once. But for our twice exceptional students, this becomes one of the biggest barriers for them to be able to access what it is that they need within the classrooms. So I'm going to do a little pop quiz in the chat. So my question is, how many steps does it take to put one piece of paper in the correct section of your binder? So if you want to take a moment and just throw in the chat, I've got a couple of numbers up here. You can put in any number you want. I'm going to open up my chat. All right, thank you. I see some 4s, some 5s. So I am going to take you through the way I see putting a piece of paper in a binder as a twice exceptional person. So let's see. First, I have to remember where my binder is, because I probably don't know. Then I have to take out my binder. I have to open it, flip to the right section, open the rings, put it in the holes. And if it's not hole punch, that opens a whole new set of problems. Then I have to close my rings. I have to flip the sections closed, close the binder, and put the binder away. And while all that is going on, those individual steps, and yes, I can break those down to even more steps if we wanted to. I have to think about things like, did I remember my binder today? And what do I do if I didn't? Very often it would be it's fine, I'll get to it later. Oh, nope, there's no hole punches in here. So either I get to go on a little side quest or I have to shove it into my binder just to make it work. Or just shove it anywhere else in my backpack. Then, inevitably at some point I open the rings and my papers go flying out, or I close my binder, but not the right way, and the papers go flying out. And just assuming that I got through all of that and my paper is now somewhere it needs to be, now I'm left going, wait, what's going on now? Because the amount of brain power it took for me to put that paper in the binder has obfuscated everything else that's going on in the classroom if I manage to do it in any form of success. So when we're thinking about where our kids are being challenged in the classroom, for a student who struggles to do things like put papers in their binders, it really is about the conversation that's going on behind the scenes in their head. We haven't even gotten to content instruction, and already the screen's overwhelming. So when we think about where our students' needs lie, we need to remember that they're starting class generally in this kind of set every day. I like this quote. I took it from an absolute expert, my mother. She has been dealing with twice exceptional children for at least 40 something years. And she said, probably while she was working with me this week on this presentation, it's as much about being ready to learn as it is about the actual learning. And if you can't get yourself into gear, the instruction itself is useless because we're not listening to what's being said. And like I said, I consider my mom an expert on that for sure, because she has spent the last 40 something years getting me organized so that I can accomplish what I need to. So classroom teachers, what can we do as in general education content teachers? What can we do to support our students in the classroom? So we're going to talk about 5 areas that we can use to support our students specifically in these areas, and things that we can incorporate in the classroom, things that don't cost us any money, things that are more about changing how we think about our approaches and not necessarily about changing everything else that there is in our classroom. So the first thing we want to talk about is establishing routines. Routines are so important for teachers. They are really important for students, and they are important for twice exceptional students. However, if you can't articulate to a twice exceptional student, why we're doing this, they're not going to do it. If they don't understand the purpose, they're just not going to do it. And what that's going to do is set up a barrier for any form of success, because they're not buying into the social norm of the classroom, which is us putting our stuff where it needs to be, turning papers in, being prepared in a certain way when the bell rings. We want to make sure that we work with our students to help them understand the why. Why do we have these routines? We also want to be able to communicate in multiple ways, and very frequently. And what communication doesn't always have to be talking. It can be using tools, it can be using signs, it can be doing check-ins and reminders. But we want to have multiple ways for our students to be able to access what those routines are. And then the last piece that I really like to use, especially when I'm starting off the school year or starting off a semester, is doing think alouds to explain how I came to my routines. So if my routine has to do with when we sharpen pencils in the classroom, I think about and I will tell them, it's hard for me to talk and think and listen to you sharpen your pencil. So we will have times during a class period where you can sharpen your pencil. But I also have a thing of pre-sharpened pencils. If your pencil breaks, you can go over and get a pencil. Having little things like that, and then having pre-sharpened pencils next to the pencil sharpener so that my students can continue to participate in class even while people are talking, is an important way to set up a routine where they are getting what their needs met, and we're also providing some other solutions in the classroom, but we're not taking out, for some of our students, when they break that pencil, whether they were taking notes or doodling, once the pencil's broken, they can't focus on what we're doing because they need to sharpen their pencil. But if we have the routine of you go to the pencil sharpener area and there's already a sharpened pencil for you. We've kind of settled the routine and been able to bring them back into what it is that we're doing. And I find throughout starting a lot of our routines, talking through the why piece helps with that buy-in. And sometimes when the students have feedback, because they will have feedback, you can find ways to tweak the routine that work for everybody and make the system a little better. So the next thing I want to talk about is providing tools to support routines. So tools are such an important thing when it comes to any part of education, whether we're talking about pencils or textbooks or computers, we have tools for everything. So when it comes to our routines, we really want to have tools there as well. Tools should be accessible to everybody in the classroom, and everybody should have first instruction on how to use any tool. And then when we have to reintroduce tools or support students with using tools to support those routines, they're not getting their first instruction individually, one-on-one, feeling called out, but rather we're reiterating what we've already done in instruction. One thing I know that we don't often talk about with we talk about twice exceptional kids, but we don't talk about with our gifted students is having strong executive functioning skills is not an innate descriptor of a gifted student. And I think a lot of times when I've worked in classrooms with our high achieving students or high expectation classrooms, wasn't quite the word I meant, our more intense classes like the AP classes, IB classes, just a lot of those upper level classes, the teachers expected that part of having a student who was ready for an advanced course was that they were ready for writing down their homework. They were ready for organizing themselves. Those are not necessarily innate characteristics. And so it is good for us to teach all of our students. And then when we work with our twice exceptional students, we might need to do the reteaching, or we might need to do some different things with them or teach it in a slightly different way. But we're still benefiting all of our students by taking just those few minutes to explain how a tool is used or what we're going to do to make a routine work. No matter how complex the task and no matter how deep the content, tools should be simple and easy to use. When our students are using tools, we don't want to have to teach them over and over again how to make that tool work, but rather we want to help them be familiar with the structure of the tool. And then as we use it throughout, or as we differentiate for our students' needs, we are able for them, they're able to use those tools without too much stress. I think one great example of when tools don't work, I know, especially in the beginning of the pandemic, when we moved to some of the online learning management systems, specifically, I'll say we were working with Canvas, and Canvas has a calendars function built in, and that seems awesome because your classes would be on there, your assignments were on there. It really seemed like it was a tool that was meant to be, until we started working with it initially, and the learning curve on the teacher side of knowing how to put in assignments and where to put them and how to label them. There was so much stuff that had to be done that the tool was almost useless for our twice exceptional students because there was no consistency, access was difficult, not everything showed up on there. And so for our students, if they had to go to multiple places to check, it was just not setting them up for success. So obviously we all learned and grew and learned how to use a lot of these systems, but the reminder for that for us is we want to make the tool itself simple. Some teachers I know use running documents where literally it's a Word document and they just have a running list of assignments. Checklists are great, especially if you're using dry erase checklists. Meaningful reminders, like having a routine of how we're reminding our students to do things. All of those are helpful tools to have in the classroom. And then the last piece of this is label everything. I don't know about you, but I can tell you at my office, all my bookshelves are labeled so I know where to put my books back. And if people borrow books, they know where they go. My kitchen is labeled with where all of our dishes go. My daughter's drawers are labeled so we know where we put our clothing away. My husband's drawers are labeled, so we know where we put our clothing away. Labeling is one of those things that I think is so important and is sometimes overlooked because it almost seems too simplistic. And in the classroom, I did label sharpened pencils, pencils that need to be sharpened, um, labeling, where our turn-in trays are, where all of our different things go in the classroom. And if we're sharing classrooms, it becomes even more crucial to label so that we're not overrunning other people's areas and that our students aren't accidentally turning in their assignment to the wrong teacher in the wrong bins. And while we're on the topic of labeling, digital labeling is a really, really important task. Um, again, these are things that take more time in the beginning to set up, but if we set our students up for success, we will see the long-term benefit. So again, I don't know about what your Google Docs folder looks like, but mine looks like, new project, new project, new project. If we don't give our kids really explicit directions on how to label, just like putting things in their binder, they're just going to drop them into one single folder on their drive. And when it's time to go back and look for things, it becomes really hard. And then one thing I know that I've seen students struggle with is making too many copies of things, not being able to find them and starting over an assignment over and over and over again until they're frustrated and they just don't want to do it at all. So taking the time to teach our students, be explicit with your labels. Label with dates as well as titles, label with keywords. And for me as a student, or as a teacher rather, I would tell my students what to label. They could choose to do their own, but if we had a common label for whatever it was we were doing, when they lost something, inevitably, I at least would have a vague idea of how to help them get where they needed to go because we were using those keywords to label. At the same time, we also have the untitled. And at last count, I know I had 65 documents in my Google folder that are called untitled. And I'm quite sure there's more. I just got bored with counting. Um, there are a lot of tools out there for teachers to use that will help our students with that labeling process. Sometimes in the learning management systems, we can label the document, and when it pushes it out to the students, it is automatically labeled. Sometimes we can do the forced copy. A lot of programs will allow you to force students to make a copy of a new document or a new work. And when they do the forced copy, it's the same title as what you have just called it. And for my students, I used to call it whatever I wanted it to be called. And then I would have your name in capital letters. And part of the routine that we learned was that they would go up and change your name to their actual name so that when they were looking for their documents, we were able to find them. And so that when I was trying to grade students' work, I could tell which students' work it was because their names were in the titles. And the same thing with doing our rubrics and checklists, having a turn it in and submission piece to that process. Don't grade the kids on being able to turn it in, but if you have, label your essay, label your folder, submit your folder at the end as part of that checklist, it builds that habit of submitting things. And submitting things is a huge piece for our kids, whether it's turning it in because it's in the backpack somewhere or whether it is that digital turn-in piece. We want to make sure that we are diligently helping the students remember to do that final step. Twice exceptional students, especially our twice exceptional students with ADHD, sometimes that final step, that I'm done piece is the hardest thing to do. And so working with our students and teaching them habits on how they can do that process is crucial. I'm also going to take a little side quest here myself and talk about my last bullet, reducing points based on submission. So I know the classic grading policy of if it's late, I take off 10%. The issue I have with that, especially when it comes to our twice exceptional students, is my grade should be based on what I know. It should be based on my mastery of content. So if I have an assignment and I get a 90% on it because I've learned 90% of the material, that makes sense. But if I've learned 90% of the material and I've gotten a 70% on the assignment because of my struggles to do the behavior of turning work in, then what we're saying is my grade is not reflective of my mastery of content. It is reflective of my ability to turn things in. Grades should not be based on behaviors, and grades shouldn't be used punitively. It doesn't work. It doesn't change student behavior. It just makes them feel bad about the struggles that they're already having. And so working with them on the front end, making it a part of the process. And for some of my students, I really did just have to go over and over their shoulder say, now please click the submit button, just to kind of keep everything moving and flowing. I think for adults, if you take a step back and really examine what you do with your life, you forget to hit send on an email, or you swear that you put something in one box when it is in another box. We all make these mistakes in our professional lives, and so we need to give our students room and grace to learn the processes and to support them in that learning piece rather than making it punitive. So I want to move on to instruction and self-monitoring. So part of the learning with our students is really helping them know when they need help. It's not always about knowing the right answers, but it is about knowing when to ask for help, or when to know within myself that there is something going on that needs to be course corrected. Time management strategies for the classroom are really important. And those time management strategies can be anything from managing actual time, test taking and those types of skills. But it also can be, if I'm looking at an assignment and we have a 45-minute class and we're 30 minutes into class and I haven't started it yet, teaching our students to be more self-aware of like, well, why am I not started? Where am I struggling? Where am I getting stuck? We could do a whole workshop just on that piece of it, but teaching them the time management strategy of looking up at the clock, making that concerted effort, calling out again when we talked about some of that first instruction, reminding students, check the time, you should be approximately at this place. And if a student isn't approximately at that place, that's okay. But if they haven't started at all, that's kind of a signal to myself and to them that we need to have a different strategy in place. Time management strategies also for the classroom look like beyond the classroom, where we're teaching our kids to estimate how much time it's going to take them to do work outside of the classroom and how much time they need to build into their lives for doing their work. I feel like a lot of what I heard, and I hear from students is because we have, our schedules at school and they know how much time they have because I tell them as a teacher how much time they have. When they get home, they have no idea how to estimate what they should be doing. That's why for a lot of my students, I tell them to use that timing, set a timer. You need to do your homework for 20 minutes tonight, because that's a finite amount of time that they can measure. They can do as much work as they can in that 20 minutes. It teaches them how much work they can do. It shows me how much work they can do. And it eliminates the thinking you have to get everything done and spending hours and hours and hours trying to get through homework. So learning some of those time management techniques is a really important process for our students. Meeting with the students and conferencing. And, when we talk about conferencing, we always think of it in terms of content, whether we're reviewing lessons or labs or, doing one-on-one instruction for content. We can do some one-on-one instruction for what is working and what strategies are and aren't working, which includes our students being able to give accurate positive feedback and accurate critical feedback. A lot of our twice exceptional students will see them do like, I don't need that, I'll remember everything. They believe that they're going to know it. Or we have that, nope, I can't do it, it never works, I'm not going to. And so when we are working with our students, we want to teach them the language of how to analyze what it is that they're doing and then share that with other people. And we're going to talk a little bit about checking for understanding. And this is where, after the presentation, that bit.ly will come in handy. So as far as instruction goes, checking for understanding is really about checking to make sure our students know what's being taught while it's being taught. And we think about it again in terms of content. But with our twice exceptional students, we also want to check in with them about what's not being taught and make sure that they're picking up on those different things. So for my check for understanding, I've broken it down into these 5 kind of broad areas where I'm providing with you questions. I find that asking students questions for some of these strategies for the checking for understanding helps them develop what it is that we want them to develop. So, whether I'm asking about a task or I'm asking about, what is it that you need? Asking our students questions helps them figure those things out. And if they don't have an answer, then we can prompt, we can give them ideas or clues. But we want them to kind of find what it is we want them to be able to articulate what it is that they need. So if you look at the handout that I have attached on that bit.ly, it is a checking for understanding question sheet, and it's just a guide to give you an idea of how you might want to ask questions in each of these 5 major areas in order to support your students' growth. And I have self-advocacy on there. Ultimately, all of this comes down to self-advocacy, because as our students learn either the strategies or where the struggles are, they are better able to advocate for what it is that they need. So just like I say to people all the time, I always know the right answer, because even if I don't know the information, I know who to ask. So for our students, I always know the right answer, because even if I don't know what strategy that works, at least I know I'm drowning and I need to ask for help. So our next area is going to be talking about trial and errors, and errors, and errors. We talk all the time about the learning process and how failure can be a better teacher than success. But then we also punish the kids when they fail. This goes back a little bit to my thing on grading, but we want to make sure that we build in those opportunities for failure and we turn them into reflections so that the failure doesn't become finite. A failure isn't the end, a failure is the what's next. And so when we fail, it helps us know where we need to have improvement, where we need to redirect ourselves. This also goes back to those pieces of honesty. Allowing a student to tell you that your system doesn't work for them can be hard, because it's a system that works for you. And especially when we have a student who might have, these executive functioning needs, and they don't feel like they're comfortable or able to say to you, this isn't working for me. We want to make sure that they have that trust and that relationship so that we can then figure out what is going to work for them and what is next. Because just like we do for other strategies, we need to differentiate. We differentiate for content, process, product. We need to differentiate for how we are how we're doing what we're doing in the classroom, what our routines look like. We don't want to differentiate for every single student, because that's not what differentiation is, but having different tools, having different opportunities and avenues and different ways to express needs are an important part of the trials and errors. And so, speaking of trials and errors, one of my favorite things to trial and then find errors on are tools that are not binders. So for my parents, this might cost a little extra because we're talking about something in the place of a binder. For my teachers, it's more about supporting what works for the student and making recommendations. I am not at all suggesting that all the teachers should go out and buy different things like this for the students. But when we go back to the diagnosing piece of diagnosing broadly, like, why aren't we able to use the binder? What's not working for us? So to do that, we need to figure out what it is that is most comfortable for the students. So these ones are for our students who like to stick things places. We have the accordion folder. The accordion folder I was introduced to when I returned to teaching high school and I started teaching in our Twice Exceptional program. I walked into one of my classrooms and 3 of my students had these accordion folders, and I was like, that's amazing. Um, you need to help them with labeling. It's a lot fewer steps because we're not trying to open rings and do all sorts of different things. They can get overwhelmed if you've got too many file folder sections, if they're not well labeled. And we still have to do some coaching about making sure we're putting things in the right section. But as far as like a maintenance system and being able to hold on to their things and always using the very front pocket for like things I need to do now, um, it is a really helpful system for our students. Doing the folders per subject, um, that's a really classic way to do it. I find that works better for our elementary school students because when you're working in a finite space, you have your cubby in the classroom with you. It's easier to go and get one folder at a time and manage just kind of that one system. Folders also rip. So if we have students who are really hard on their papers, hard on their materials, the paper folders are not necessarily going to be the best system. And I know the plastic folders are usually pretty flimsy and they tend to drop papers even more frequently. So when we're considering different ways that we want our students to trial their organization systems, we want to make sure that we're thinking about things other than just the organizing itself, but the actual living with the material. Um, the spiral with pockets. For me, the spiral with pockets was my saving grace for most of high school and all of college. I am not a binder person. I don't like binders. Um, but I needed an organizational system. The folder system didn't work for me. I tried other things, they did not work for me. But when I was introduced to spirals with pockets, it became exactly what I needed because all of my notes were locked in because it's a spiral. Unless I yanked them out, my notes would stay where I put them. My front pocket was for things I need to do, and my back pocket was things I need to keep. And that was it. And I could stuff things in. I didn't have to use rings. And to me, it was so much more of a manageable system. Yes, if I drop it, everything falls out. But for the most part, I was able to kind of hold on to what it was I needed. Um, one of the things to know with this is because they only come in 1, 3, 5 units. If you have a 7-period day, you have to think about how you're going to manage having multiple items. But again, for me, because I was given some of the freedom to try different things, I finally found a system that worked. And it's a system that I really used up until I tried to go as digital as possible. So all of the notebooks I use now are still spiral bound with pockets in them so that I can keep track of whatever it is I'm supposed to be keeping track of. Um, so the last 2 tools, one of them I'm going to show you. I don't hate on binders. They just don't work for me, and there are ways that we can use them. Um, one of them is the keep it in class method. And again, for an elementary setting, this is a pretty easy method to figure out because you have your kids with you all or most of the day. In secondary, it's a little bit harder, but I will say that in terms of using it in secondary, it was actually a gen ed teacher who implemented it and showed me how they implemented it um, for their students in a general education setting without having any additional support people with them. And the keep it in class that this particular teacher used was very much like we have here. It was a milk crate, and each kid had their own hanging folder. One of the key pieces was that it was available to everybody, but not everybody used it. And my students who lost a lot of things would always use it. And so there was some forced direction, but there was also that opportunity. So when our kids feel like they might be called out for using some of these tools, that's where again, that importance of offering it to everybody and saying, okay, guys, this is something that we have available to us. So if you're a person who doesn't like to carry around a lot of papers or you're worried you're going to lose it, you have the opportunity to leave it here and just come retrieve it when you need it. And so it does require more teacher support. But it's something that can be used effectively. And for my students who had a resource class, they could go down to the classroom and get the materials that they needed. One thing I really liked was, it obviously is harder if you're doing something that kids have to take to class, to resource, to home, but for things that they mostly need during the school day, it was a great system. And so within my classroom, I would have my students go, and one student would get multiple folders for their peers. And it's very interesting because when the students were responsible for other people's things, they were much more careful with them than if it was just theirs. Um, and so we got really good at one person picking up, one person bringing back, and everybody kind of supported each other and staying a little bit more organized and maintaining their materials so that they were able to remember to keep track of those materials. And then part of that also was whoever was bringing back the folders handed all the completed work to the teacher. So there was also that built in of the submission piece that is difficult, but because they were submitting for multiple people, it stayed in their heads longer and they were more successful in turning things in. And then the multiple binders piece, like I said, it's not that I hate binders, and binders really do work for some kids, and some kids do really great with a 3 or 4 inch binder and everything's in it. And some kids do well with a binder that maybe only has 2 classes in it, so it doesn't get as much wear and tear, and they're able to keep it more minimalistic and usable. And then there's also the piece where you've got the folders and spirals that have the hole punches in them. So you could use a combination of different items where you do have the folders to, shove things into, but you're keeping it in a 3-ring binder so everything is staying together. So when we talk about those trials and errors, in order to know what system works, other systems have to not work. And so when we're giving our students those opportunities to figure out what works for them, we have to help them be reflective on what doesn't work for them and lead them in another direction without penalizing them for the system not working. And actually, in the chat, if you guys have systems, if you guys use any of these systems or you have a different system, that is one of my favorite things to collect is different ways to organize our students to help them manage those day-to-day materials that they need. So do feel free to toss that in the chat. So our next section is talking about supporting our students as they establish their own routines. If our students are coming in and they have a significant amount of need as far as that instruction goes, or as far as routines go, we wouldn't necessarily expect them to develop an entire personal system within one school year. But what we can do is that we can support them in those opportunities that they have for establishing those routines and developing skills to be independent. So the first thing we can do when we're establishing personal routines is help the students highlight what is working for them. Our students are not always cognizant when things are working for them. It just works and they accept it. So taking the time to say, hey, you've been doing a great job with turning your stuff in. You've been doing a great job with maintaining all of the things that you need. You've been doing a great job with not calling out so frequently in class every time you have an idea. What is it that we're working on? And have some reflection about what's working and why. Positive feedback and positive highlighting is a really important part of supporting our students with some of these executive functioning pieces. Teaching those explicit strategies for managing time and self. So one of my favorite ones, my twice exceptional kids, always calling out in the classroom, and we're not surprised. We don't like to write things down, but we want to tell and share when we have the answer. And when our exceptionality is related to something like ADHD and we are more impulsive than our peers, we don't always also realize that we're more impulsive. There's more of that need to show that we know things because we are struggling in other areas. And so one of the strategies I used to use for my students was I would give, I had 2 different ways. One was I would give a sticky note. And every time they gave an answer or wanted to give an answer, I had them put a little tick mark on it. I didn't stop them from calling out other than to remind them that we weren't supposed to be doing that, but I had them self-check how many times. And so for my one student who realized that they called out 25 times in like 15 minutes, it was an awakening for her. She did not realize how much she actually was calling out in the classroom. And so from there, that's not true baseline data, but it's essentially baseline data. We said, okay, well, what is it that we want to do? What feels more appropriate? What do you think you're actually doing? And so by teaching her the strategies of identifying every time she had a thought that she wanted to express out loud, she was able to start to manage when she was calling out and being more thoughtful about what she was saying. I also have done that with the support of a journal where every time you have a question, write your question down, because your question might get answered in the course of instruction, or you might end up getting having somebody else ask the question as well, and then it is not just one person dominating the conversation. So teaching our students to be self-aware and to understand what their norms are in the classroom and what those social norms look like is an important part of it. And for when we're looking at it in a general classroom with a whole lot of students, sometimes we can do that activity as a whole group. You know, if you have a very chatty class, in a class where a lot of kids are calling out over top of each other, have them use those strategies, have them write down their questions before they ask them, have them mark how often they are calling out for themselves, and just helping them to think about and be more aware of what they're doing as a whole class. And then again, you do the specialized instruction or the extra instruction for your twice exceptional kids when they need a little bit more. And the last piece on this is, we talked about tools earlier, and one thing that we can definitely have our students do is adapt tools. Find things that are working or kind of working and let them tweak them so they can use them in other settings, so that they can use them in your setting, but use them in a different way. When we're talking about highlighting what's working, we also will talk about what's not working and how could we change a tool or adapt a tool so that is more user-friendly for our students. And part of the process of adapting those tools is giving them ownership and control over how they're monitoring, how they're doing, how they're growing within the classroom, so that when they are more independent or they are on their own in college, in life, they have an idea of how you take a tool and make it work for another situation. So I want to talk a little bit about the art of backmapping. Backmapping is great. Backmapping is something that as teachers, we do all the time. You know, we start at the beginning of our quarter, our semester, and we know where we need to get to. We know where the end of a project is, but what we don't always know is how long it's going to take us to get there. And so we start counting backwards and working our way backwards, making sure we're fitting in all our standards. And by the time we're done, we know where we're starting on the first day. Students don't know how to do that. Students tend to think very linearly, whether they are twice exceptional or not. When they're first giving them an assignment, they're looking at that due date. And so what we want to do is teach them how to go about that back mapping process. And again, this particular strategy is one that I started doing with one of my general education co-teachers. And it was a lesson that we would do at the beginning of projects. And we tapered off how much instruction we gave, like anything else. But when we had our first major project in the classroom, we gave them a one-sheeter of everything that was expected, including the rubric. And it was a 2-week project. So we included a table with 5 boxes across 2 rows. And we started talking through, we had them write in the last one, like project due. And then we started talking about the different steps and asking them, you know, well, how long do you guys think that might take? And as we had a conversation as a whole class, our students were able to start to see why we started, why the back mapping was important. Because by the time we got to the end of, okay, so what day do we need to start this project? The answer was today, because we've mapped out what we need to do over those 2 weeks. And in that conversation, we did talk about things like, you know, the weekend is in between. Are you going to work on the weekend? No? Okay, well, then we need to figure that time in here. For our student athletes, you guys have a big game coming up and you're going to be busy that night. Okay, well, then we have to move how much time we're spending on another day. And so as we talked through the process, our students were able to learn how to make some of those choices and decisions. For my Twice Exceptional students, I did have to keep doing more explicit instruction more frequently, but as it became kind of a thing for the classroom, by the end of the school year, we would hand out a project sheet and the students would talk amongst themselves and kind of work on what they thought that timeline would look like on their own. And then they would also have an idea of how they might adapt it or when they might need to adapt what it is that they're doing. Along with that, we're going to talk about a couple different ways to look at extended time. So we're going to start with incremental due dates. And I like incremental due dates in that they give you sliding due dates or sliding check-in points really throughout a process with a one final deadline. The process that I talked about just now with the back mapping included those incremental deadlines because we would because with the students, we would say, this is English class, so, we need to have our thesis statement done by here. We need to have most of our research done by here. And as we worked through it, students would see it might take a little more time or a little less time than what they planned. And so we would help them adjust their calendars to figure out how much time they would need for the next step. I really like it because this also allows you to incorporate students' extended time into each step, because we all know if everybody has a week and a student with extended time has a week and a half, well, that's just 4 days later, they're going to start it at the last minute anyway. If we don't teach our students how to use their extended time and use it effectively, then it just becomes another procrastination tool. And so with incremental due dates, we can build that extended time in as we go step by step, and then talk with our students to help them see where that extended time is being used. The other thing that's great for incremental due dates is if I have a student who's struggling and a student who, the plan was to get started for step one and the plan was 3 days. At worst, I know when we're 3 days behind. But when I know that they're 3 days behind, but I haven't gotten to the end of the project to find out my student hasn't started yet. So when we're working with our students on this piece, the idea is still that we're trying to get to the same deadline as everybody else, or the same extended time deadline as everybody who has extended time, but we have that one focused deadline. So what this kind of looks like is, like I said, we have a 2-week project plan and we estimate the amount of time. We think it's going to take 10 days. But what it actually ends up looking like in the end is step one only took 2 days, but step two was a lot more complicated than we anticipated. We had to break it in half. So we had 6 steps really in that section. The final one took 3 days, just like we thought it would. And now we're at 11 days for our project. We're still within, like with any teacher, we're still within where we kind of wanted to be. But we've walked ourselves through that. And then with our Twice Exceptional kids, we've given them the extended time where they need it. Obviously we provide the extended time if it's in their IEP or 504, but as we're providing the extended time, we're also kind of getting an opportunity to see, do they need the extended time on the research part? Do they need the extended time on the writing? Do they need it on the editing and organizing? Where is it that our students need that specific support? And again, I know as I go throughout where they're getting hung up so that we don't get to the end of a project just to find out we haven't started yet. And I like adding in our incremental due dates with flexible due dates as well. So the difference is with that incremental due dates is those are more, like I said, check-ins. We have one deadline and we're checking in along the way till we get to our deadline. For our flexible due dates, this is something that we did more for students when they needed it. It wasn't a flexible due date for the entire class. And so again, this gives us the opportunity to take into account the extended time so that we might have a completely different due date for a student. It was really helpful when we had students who were very accelerated in certain areas and they would get their work done very, very quickly. We could help slow them down as we checked in those incrementals to help say to them, that's awesome. if this is an area of interest for you, can you go more into depth? Can you pull more ideas out? How might you look at that differently? And really be able to hone in on where their interest lay so that they could spend more time on those parts of it while the rest of the class might be moving towards just that initial trajectory that we had. It also helps to reduce the last minute work because we have those check-in points. But we're also adaptable with our students who need it. So whether, they miss something for illness, I said, I had a lot of student athletes, and helping them manage their time was a really important thing that we were teaching them. Often my students who were in our advanced English classes were also in the advanced social studies and science classes. And so, when they had a big project due in another class, we would have that conversation. Can you handle having two projects on the same day? What does this look like versus this? And so, every so often it would happen where a student would say, "You've got such a major test. I need this extra time. Could I bump this a day or two?" And because we're talking a few students and it's not frequent, we're able again to be flexible with our due dates. This part's important because it's a mindset shift. Because again, I know the classic way we do this is, we give an assignment and we have a deadline. And for small things, that makes sense. But for larger projects, for things that have multiple steps that we want our students to get through, we need to think about our extended time differently. We need to think about how we're managing that, because ultimately we control the time in our classrooms and we control what we do and when we do it and how much time we have. And so what it takes for us is just thinking about time differently and thinking about how we can make things doable for our students without becoming overwhelming, how we are teaching them to manage their time, how we're teaching them to advocate for themselves and what they need, and also still maintain that accountability of, okay, if we're looking at different time, let's talk about what that different time looks like. It's not open-ended forever, but it's rather really focused in and talking about what is it that you need to be successful on this part of a project. I'm sorry, I know I froze there for a moment. Extended time in and of itself is important. Our students, often have extended time. Extended time is measurable. It tells us exactly how much time we are supposed to be providing for the students. Just adding on extended time, like I said, that is a very traditional way to look at extended time. And for students who have strong time management skills, and the extended time really is just the accommodation piece, they might be okay with just having the extra time added on. But for the most part, whether students have special education needs or not, teaching them how to use these different ways to manage their time and manage their extended time is going to go a long way towards helping them understand how their processes work and how they can support themselves how they can support themselves. So our last section that I'm going to talk about before we go into Q&A is on being proactive. So who do you need to be proactive with as we're kind of working our way through supporting our students in the classroom? So the first person you need to be proactive with is your twice exceptional student. You really should not ever go more than 2 weeks without having a one-on-one check-in with a student. And a one-on-one check-in doesn't have to be a 15-minute meeting after school. It can be pulling them up to your desk or going over to their desk and having a one-on-one conversation during the class period. It could be, in elementary school, we call it lunch bunches. In high school, we do not. But still inviting students into the classroom for lunch. And then while we're having lunch, pulling kids one-on-one to just do a quick check-in with them. How is it going? Are things going well? Building that relationship. It's not always checking in just in order to talk about assignments, but scheduling that time to make sure that we recognize and know who they are and build the relationships with them. Because twice exceptional students can have issues around some of those social norms of being able to know how to build a relationship with a teacher without thinking the teacher is their best friend. Understanding, where that relationship is. As the teacher, you can do that by building in, how are you doing? What are you up to? What have you accomplished lately that you're really proud of? that's great. And then turn it maybe a little bit to, I noticed that you're doing a great job turning things in class, and that's awesome. Is there anything you need from me? Um, it's just those little moments in there that make sure our students know that we haven't forgotten about them. Because when you get lost and bogged down in all those cloud bubbles that we saw earlier, sometimes it's hard to remember who is out there to help you and check in. And the other piece is, it's a good modeling strategy. Never walk away from the meetings without talking about your next meeting, and take the opportunity to do a little bit of modeling with the student, looking at your calendar, figuring out, okay, we're going to meet in this many days and we're going to take this amount of time, and I'm going to look through my calendar and see and make sure and put it on there and schedule. Again, we're just doing this as an exercise. A lot of our students, especially the older ones, have phones. Having them put the meeting in their phone builds that habit where they're checking what's available, they're making those appointments, and they are building that as a part of who they are. The next folks you want to be proactive with are your parents. And I know parents who are on this call will love to see that. Being proactive with parents means getting the information to them upfront. And upfront does not mean the first week of the semester. It can mean upfront from a project or upfront before a school break, making sure that you're making pointed efforts to send home information, making sure you're sharing with the parents what is the most important information, and then giving parents access to things like a calendar or a homework document, just so that they can keep track of kind of what's going on and be able to support their students. As I said earlier, my mom still provides some support for me, even if it's me calling her and just going through, I've got a couple of big projects coming up and I just want to talk to you about them for a few minutes. And by the time we're done, sometimes my mom doesn't even talk back, but I'm more settled and I know what it is that I'm doing. So for our students, if they're not sure what it is they're doing, the parents can't be the sounding board. If they know upfront what it is that the students are working on in the classroom, then they can be that sounding board to support their students and to help provide some of those reminders at home. Also communicating with parents, what is the best way to reach you and when are the best times to reach you? Some teachers respond to emails during the day, some do not. So just making sure you're setting aside what time you respond to things. And if you have office hours that you use to call parents or contact parents, make sure the parents are aware of that so that they can take advantage and that they can plan accordingly as well. The next group you want to be proactive with is going to be your special education team. Whether or not your students have 504s or IEPs, your special education team is going to be important when you have twice exceptional students, because as special educators, that's what we do. We help specialize instruction. We help make instruction accessible, whether we're talking about an AP class, an IB class, or a remedial class. Our job is accessibility. And so reaching out to your special ed team and asking for tips, asking for ideas, saying, I've tried this and this. Do you have any other ideas that we could use? It's a great way to build collegial rapport. And it also takes advantage of what our special educators know. Now, for your students who do have IEPs and 504s, please read them. You are responsible for them as the teacher. It is not just the case manager, just the special educator who's responsible. And if you don't know what something means in the IEP or 504, ask for clarification, ask for ideas, ask for a definition even. But make sure that you are keeping track of what it is that you need to know, because those are legal documents that you have to know. Schedule check-ins with your special ed teachers, especially again if you have kids who have 504s and IEPs. Try to make sure that you schedule a check-in quarterly, just so that the teacher can hear from you, they know what's going on with their student. And again, just like with our students needing to practice scheduling, sending invitations and scheduling time with your special educators goes a long way towards keeping those lines of communication open, because you guys are all busy. And so you want to find a common time and hold that common time to meet. Document when you have students with 504s and IEPs, every time you talk to the students, every time you talk to the parents, just a quick note to document what it is. If you find a strategy that really works with a kid, write it down, because that's something that a case manager is going to want to know. And if you find something that really doesn't work with a kid, we also want to know that, because if something isn't working, we don't want to keep trying it over and over and over again. And so we want to have that type of data to better support the IEPs, better tweak IEPs, to better then meet the needs of our students. I did have that link on there. Any links that you share with parents, share with the case managers as well, because whether they're supporting through a resource class or just supporting in general, having access to what it is the kids are supposed to be doing is critical. For those of you who are lucky enough to have paraeducators or instructional assistants in your classroom, using them, and when you use paras or IAs in your classroom, you use them in a different way than you do with a co-teacher. Because when you have a co-teacher, you're both teachers, you're both in there, teaching, supporting, doing what it is you do. When you have a para or an IA in your room, they don't have that same level of responsibility to the classroom. And a lot of times, they prefer to have some direction. Paras are switching. Usually every period is a different teacher, and every teacher has something different that they want. And so rather than having your paras guess what it is that you want, tell them, this is how I like to run my class. This is how I like to use your support. And also telling them, we have these twice exceptional students. This is what twice exceptional means. Even if it's just a one line about what twice exceptional might look like, reminding them that the twice exceptional students are the students who need the support about everything except the content. Usually the content is the easy part, but they need all of those other pieces. So when we talked earlier about communication reminders, multiple ways of doing it, leveraging your para or your IA to support your students, that is a way to do it. Schedule weekly check-ins just like you do with case managers. And don't forget that paras can do some teaching as well. They can teach a small group, whether it's doing enrichment or doing reminders, or, we have students who just were struggling to get started. We have students who worked really far ahead and we want to keep their momentum going. Use your para to support those small groups. Teaching them what those strategies are that you are teaching to the whole class, and having them do those checking in, and having them support the students when they do need further instruction or when they do need more frequent reminders, and giving them the guidance of what it is for you to support your students so that they can be successful, they can learn their skills, and they can become more independent. Because ultimately, that's what we're looking for. We're trying to figure out what we can do as instructors to set up our classrooms for success, to set our students up for success, so that when they leave our classroom, besides the content knowledge, they also leave with an understanding of how they can organize themselves and organize their lives so that they can continue to be successful. I share frequently about my experiences, and for me, a lot of these things, other than what my family did to support me, were things that I learned the hard way, that I learned on my own. I learned when I got to college. I learned later in college even, and some of it not even until grad school, because I never really had that explicit instruction. So one thing I have taken as a teacher is to provide that explicit instruction to all of my students, the extra instruction to my students who need the extra instruction, but with the goal that one of the things they walk away with is meaningful strategies for them to be successful as they move further and outside of my classroom. So I just really liked this quote. You probably saw quotes throughout. I just like adding quotes to things because I think it helps with perspectives. But I really like this one because I'm an English teacher. But like the sonnets are very, very structured forms of poetry. But there's so much freedom once you understand what the structure is, and you can have so much fun within the writing once you understand the structure. And that's really what these executive functioning strategies are about. We're helping our students establish structure so that they can be the bright and brilliant kids that they are, and they can share those amazing ideas that they have, and they don't get tripped up and bogged down in the hard stuff, in the organization, in the submission, and things that feel like they should be easier because we have those established rules, but for our kids, they're not. And so we're helping them on the part that's hard so that they can do the part that's easy, which is being brilliant and unique. So that's what I have, and we should be able to open up for Q&A.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. So if you have a question, you can put it in the Q&A box. It's in the bottom row here. And Sarah, it looks like there was some comments. Carla noted that as a student with an IEP, the best skill she learned from her special education teacher was how to self-advocate and how well that served her in middle school and beyond.
Absolutely. And Carla and I talk about this sometimes, but self-advocacy is huge. And for me, I really focused on that. It's one of the things I love about teaching high school was that for my 11th and 12th graders, the focus of that resource class and that support class was really the self-advocacy piece, because when our kids go to college, there's nobody to advocate for them. There are some colleges out there who are doing some really cool things. I had a former student come and do guest speaking with the class I taught, 2 teachers in our county, and she was talking about some of the really cool things. They have an executive functioning club at her college, and I learned stuff that she was telling us about. But by and large, colleges don't have those kinds of supports. And so, as successful as a kid can be getting support from me as a teacher, if they don't learn those skills, they're going to go to college and flounder. And so, part of building up and doing this explicit instruction across their day is also so that we can taper it on the back end, so that when they go to college, they are ready to say to a professor, I really need this. I have a lot of students who are dual enrolled, so they're in our local community college as well as the high schools. And it's really hard when they're 15 and 16 years old to go to a professor and say, I need this. And we have to practice. And I have practiced with emails. I've practiced, just talking out, playing the mean professor, playing the nice professor, and just kind of giving kids the voice so that they can tell the people what it is that they need, because that's also a skill they need when they get to the work world. I have to tell my supervisor anytime I have a new boss, I have to tell them what I need. And that can be hard even at my age. So it's all about building those skills so that they can become more independent.
Excellent. And on that vein around executive functioning, Nicole asks if you can recommend any specific sites or resources to teach adolescents and teens executive functioning skills. She's wanting to give her students some resources.
So I always love pulling from a variety of places. The ones I recommend most frequently are the Smart But Scattered series. I really like that they have expanded the series, and they have one specific for teens, specific for young adults. They even have one that's called Failure to Launch, and it's for young adults who are basically living in their parents' basement. But that series now to me covers really almost grades 3 through being an adult. And there are things that we use in our household. CooperCon, Late Lost and Unprepared. Sometimes having kids read about executive functioning, even though again it seems like a weird thing to do, allowing them to understand that process and have some of those resources. I really like those. Emily Morris, in her Teaching Twice Exceptional Learners book, she has some really good surveys, or surveys might not be the right word that I'm looking for, but like worksheet things that you can use to support your students and to help them figure out where those needs are. And then the Executive Functioning Workbook, and I'm totally blanking on who was the author, but I know it's blue and it's spiral. My kids found the book I actually one year bought the books for all the kids in the class because I was like, awesome, this is an executive functioning agenda book. This is going to be something that we can really use. No, it didn't work like that. But what I really did like are the reproducibles in there, because the kids took quizzes on like what their executive functioning styles were. And what was valuable for some was taking the quiz, and what was valuable for some was losing the quiz. And that really kind of gave us Well, if we're going to lose our quiz on what are our executive functioning skills, I think we know where we're starting from. So I always use a variety of resources, and different people say things in different ways. They have different flavors, they have different graphics. So anything that you can do to keep keep up the spice and the variety. And I didn't say I usually work it into my conversation, but um, dry erase markers, dry erase calendars, and multiple colors of dry erase. I don't know what it is. They don't even have the scent anymore like they did in the old days. But like, I have yet to meet a twice exceptional person who is not addicted to having lots of dry erase markers. And I have dry erase markers throughout we painted the entire section of our kitchen in dry erase paint so that we can write on the wall to each other. Like, I don't know why dry erase is where it's at, but dry erase is where it's at.
I think they've expanded that workbooks series that the executive functioning workbook is part of as well to have a lot of different topics too, if people are interested in looking at that series. Carla also commented about teachers asking kids to work in groups, but not teaching group work. Curious if you have any thoughts on teaching group work to your 2E students.
I do. One of the things I really love right now within our county, we've just rolled out a new enriched literacy curriculum for our 4th and 5th graders. And we have what we call the third column. And the third column is a whole thing on how you can make modifications and adaptations for our EML learners and for our twice exceptional learners. And every time there's group work, I have, we give them, and in the beginning, we talk about them for modeling, but the rules of discourse, we give them sentence stems. And honestly, a lot of the kids, not just my twice exceptional kids, need sentence stems just to say, I agree, I disagree. I like what you said, but I like what you said, and so giving them sentence stems and having them use them, you can cut them into cards, you can keep them as a sheet of paper. Having roles, I know there's lots of different ways we can do things like literature circles is one, or any group work, but really for our twice exceptional kids, you really do need to assign them a role, because if they don't know what it is they're doing, they're either going to do all of it or none of it. They're not going to find an in between. So defining roles for them, being very strategic with who's in those groups, because with all kids, we want them to learn to work with multiple people, but our kids are also having a lot of struggles, so we want to set them up for success. So putting a bunch of twice exceptional kids in a group together, you're going to get some amazing ideas, but you're going to get zero work product. So, spreading the wealth around to multiple groups, and pairing kids up with where their strengths and needs are so that they can complement each other, and complementing each other in a different way. A lot of the instruction for our kids really is around other people have valuable opinions too. Yes, you do need to listen to them. Yes, it's possible for you to be wrong sometimes. And so teaching our kids how to stop and listen to each other, both socially and in groups, is a really important thing. So like within our curriculum, like I said in the beginning, we have the links, and we recommend that teachers talk about them and teach them to the class. But every time there's a group project mentioned in the curriculum, we relink those things in and say, don't forget to give these to your twice exceptional learners. They might still need the sentence stems, the prompts, the roles, the rules every time they meet.
Awesome. Great ideas. Are there any other questions? You can pop them in the chat or the Q&A. Any other last pieces of wisdom as people start the school year?
I think, the most important thing to me is to try and be patient with yourself and patient with your students. I still try, I teach adults now, but I still try things and they work or don't work. And we just have to give each other a little bit of grace, because a lot of us also lost skills during the pandemic, even as adults. It was harder to teach a lot of these skills to our kids, so they have these deficits. And it's not just academic deficits, but it is the social deficits, the executive functioning deficits. And so even if it's not a disability, that piece is still there. And so reteaching our kids how to do these things and how to incorporate it into their lives is an important part of education now. So, yeah.
Well, thank you so
These are
much.
some good questions.
There were so many practical suggestions and resources in here. And if you guys need it, the bit.ly will be included with the recording when we send it out. And also I'll go ahead and stick it again here in the chat for anybody who missed that. And I know that Sarah's got her presentation and resources at that link. So if you need that link, there it is. Thank you again, Sarah, for this webinar. We really appreciate it. Just a reminder to everybody that this has been recorded and we will have it posted probably early next week since we're about to head into the long weekend here. But we'll have it posted and available for you guys to view for 30 days and revisit at any time during that time frame. I also want to just remind everyone that we are getting closer to NAGC 23, which is our annual convention. It's going to be November 9th through 12th in Orlando at Coronado Springs Resort. Registration is open and the session information is also available if you click on the schedule tab. We do have quite a few Twice Exceptional sessions at the event. I have to say, in scheduling the events, I had to really make sure we spread those out for everybody. So there are a lot of really great sessions available, along with other practical and interactive sessions meant for educators of gifted students like yourselves. So we hope to see all of you there. And it looks like that is it. So thank you so much, Sarah, and hope you guys all have a really great evening.
Thank you so much.